Hi Dragons! We're on part 2 in victimology, and we were talking about the Middle Ages and the history of victimology in the Middle Ages, the kings and all of that fun stuff. So, this is the way things were in the Middle Ages, and then it fell into disuse. And it fell into disuse for a couple of reasons. Number one, we talk about this time as the fall of the victim justice system, which the two things were that led up to that fall was the feudal barons, the people who were hearing the cases and had their sections of property that the king had them hear things for. They decided to lay claim to any compensation that the offenders paid the victim. So they wanted a cut of the action. And this is the beginning of what we have in the United States today, where a crime that you commit is not necessarily against an individual. It really is, but in the bigger picture, we consider it a crime against the state. Okay, so that was the beginning of that. And so they did this redefinition of criminal acts. And they saw it as against the state versus against the victim, which, as you can imagine, pushed the victim further away. And then the people, the feudal barons who were hearing those cases, they reaped, I don't want to say rewards, but they reaped any compensation because of restitution. And so from this point on, the victim sort of diminished in terms of stature. The other thing that led to the criminal justice system and from the victim justice system was that society itself was transforming, okay? And it went from a rural agrarian kind of existence to an industrial one. So previously people lived in small groups in different sections, and they earned a living and were subsistence living from what they made from the fields, from their work in the fields. And life was a struggle to meet their daily needs. And so people were self-sufficient, they relied on their family, and they lived in relative isolation. And if there was a crime, it harmed the family physically and economically, in addition to the victim. And we call this the Gemeinschaft Society, Gemeinschaft, the Gemeinschaft Society. If you're following along in the PowerPoints, this means that the individual handles their own problem. During the Middle Ages, it ended with the Industrial Revolution, and we saw bigger, more urban communities. People were distant from, rural areas, from subsisting by their own efforts, working in the fields. And now they lived in cities, and some of them were cramped in close quarters. They were surrounded by strangers who they didn't know. It became more and more depersonalized society. And the interpersonal ties that once held people together began to slip away. And we call this the Gesellschaft Society, Gesellschaft, and which that basically means is that if you're not taking care of yourself anymore, society is taking care of the individual. And they helped crumble the victim justice system. Those two things together makes a great essay question. I will tell you along the way, hey, it's a great true and false question. It's a great essay question. You should pay attention because you might see it on a test. Just like lex talionis makes a great define, identify, or true and false question. So crime began to threaten the social fabric of the society, the thing that held the people together. And the focus began to shift from making the victim whole to dealing with the offender and the criminal. So that's where it made the shift to criminal justice versus victim justice. So it was replaced, victim justice was replaced by criminal justice. And some people refer to it as victim injustice system, okay? So today, victims are a little more than witnesses for the state over what happened to them. They cannot take matters into their own hands because that would be illegal. And the victim has to wait for society to act. Now, the civil justice system, which we're going to talk about, the civil justice system, in that case, the victim has more power than in the criminal justice system. But still, there are limits on that power, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that forever because that's really important. I really am an advocate of the civil justice system. I think all the big crimes are there versus in the criminal justice system. And I know that most people come to Tiffin University, hot and heavy for the crime and criminals and the criminal justice system, and I think all the real devils are in the civil justice system. Those crimes are really insane in my opinion. That's just my opinion. So now what we see is we have the state and institutions protecting the state as the victim in law enforcement and corrections, the court system, and the system is sort of forgotten about the victims and their interests and focused on the offender and the accused and the criminal justice system. Okay, so the victim in all of this has began to reemerge. We've been seeing a reemergence of the victim, and but now most of the time the criminal justice system spends a good part of its time and energy trying to control criminals, offenders. And in trying to understand the criminal, the reemergence of the victim came into focus. And it wasn't as someone who needed sympathy or compassion, but rather as someone who may have contributed to their own demise. Okay, so we had a lot of research that's coming out that was essentially victim blaming for a long time. These are all evolutionary trends, and we're basically going through time. Okay, so it became fashionable to look at the relationship between the victim and the offender and understand the crime. So there was a formal inquiry into victimology. And what was it? A subspecialty? Was it an actual field? Academics argued for a long time about whether it should be specific or broad and what victimology should look like. Should it be theoretical? Should it be empirical? So people became interested in this field. Academics started to publish, started to make policies, laws, that kind of thing. The first publication that we have that's made it into victimology was von Henting's The Criminal and His Victim. And von Henting was a German scholar trying to figure out why a criminal was predisposed to being a criminal. Like, what made a criminal a criminal? Why did they behave like that? So it made him question what made the victim a victim. Okay, if you're going to ask what makes the criminal a criminal, what makes the victim the victim? And he decided that he coined the term the criminal victim dyad and said that this was really important. And he made the case that the victim often contributed to the cause of the crime. So when the victim was the aggressor, but because of a turn of events, he ended up being the victim. So if you start a fight and someone else finishes it, then you started it, and that's how you ended up being the victim. And so he stressed that the outcome of the event, the crime itself didn't tell the whole story. There had to be a backstory about the offender, what prompted the offender, and a closer inspection was very important. So von Henting's work, von Henting's work, Criminal and His Victim, cast the victim as the agent provocateur. Okay, so the agent of his own victimization. And he said, increased attention should be paid to the crime, provocative function of the victim, with a thorough knowledge of the interrelationship between the doer and the sufferer. New approaches of detection of crime should be opened. So we started looking into that dynamic and actually what prompted the crime to occur, and what was all involved in it, not just the outcome, the crime. Okay, so he didn't think that the victims were totally to blame, but much of the contribution comes from characteristics, social position beyond the control of the person, and he had 13 classifications of victims, and that is in your text, and it just has all the different types of victims based on the crime that they were in. So his types show that the inability to resist a perpetrator because of some social or physical or psychological disadvantage or some situation. This was his typology, and this is how he classified people. So the typology didn't apply that the victim was always the cause of the act, but that some characteristics may contribute to what ultimately happened to the victim. Okay, so the victim was like one of the determinants, and to explore between the offender and the victim. Then along came Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn is the father of victimology. He coined the term victimology. So he is the father of victimology. Makes a great identifier in a test. True and false question. So also with books. I like to do matching with books and terms. So he was also interested in the dynamic between victims and their offenders, and he asked for detailed and probing questionnaires to be completed because he wanted to find out, to research on it. And he discovered there was usually a strong relationship between the victim and the offender. And he had a 6-step classification of victims, but he based them on legal considerations and the degree of victim blame. We have that in the civil justice system today. It's called contributory negligence. In other words, that the victim had contributed to something that happened to them. So Mendelssohn's typology ranged from completely innocent victim to one that was more guilty than the offender. So it was a continuum, okay? And the most guilty victim was someone who entered the situation as the offender, but then the tables turned and he became the victim. So Mendelssohn's classification is used for identifying the culpability of the victim and the criminal act. Then Schaefer came out with his book, The Victim and His Criminal, which is kind of a play on words. And his work was popular in the 50s and 60s. And yes, that title was a twist on von Henting's title. So he set forth the responsibility of the victim on different levels as well. He had his classification system as well. So early scholars did not look at the damage offenders inflicted on the victim. They ignored repercussions. They ignored rehabilitation. They bypassed a lot of other things that today we look at very commonly, but they were just starting. So they had to start somewhere, and that's where they started looking at the dyad between the two. So, so that whole examination of how the victim and the offender were related created what we now know as the field of victimology. One of the things that was really predominant in victimology in the early days was victim precipitation. What happened to precipitate the behavior of the offender on the victim? So you could be passive, like nothing that you did elicited that response, or you could be an active participant where your behavior was really spurring on what the offender did to the victim. Each typology says the victim has some causative role in the crime. And Wolfgang, who was a scholar, he had a student named Amir. And Amir really started to test the dyad empirically. But what he did was he lit the powder keg, okay? Wolfgang and Amir. So Wolfgang is the primary author, and Amir is his student. So Wolfgang used homicide data from Philadelphia, and he found that 26% of all homicides, the victim did have some sort of precipitation. And the victim was the first, maybe in 26% of those cases, to use or to show deadly force. I can show you my gun. So they are the ones that essentially started 26% of the cases. And Wolfgang found 3 different steps. 1, there was some prior relationship. The victim was more likely to die at the hands of someone who they knew versus a stranger. Still true today. So have some knowledge of the person. It starts as a small thing, but it gets into something big. And number 3, alcohol makes people stupid. Alcohol was very common in those crimes as something that loosened up your inhibitions, made people, more likely to be belligerent, maybe more provocative. They provoked someone. They had a deadly exchange or a violent exchange. So drinking, was always part of his category. Wolfgang concluded that the idea of a weak passive victim trying to run away isn't always right. So when Amir took over, Amir did research on controversial things. He took that data from Philadelphia and looked at rape between 1958 and 1960, and he said 19%, so 20% of all rapes, the victim started it. That really got into a lot of victim blaming. And his interpretation put the blame on the victim's dress and the victim's mannerisms, the use of language, indecency of the victim, and it set a long, difficult process for victim blaming. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to make part 3. So we're going to continue with Amir on the next part.